Jasmine reveals how Rick Scott's bill could crumble under its own ramifications and how citizens are now preserving evidence he cannot shield ICE agents from. Because what she disclosed about ICE violations in the political concealment transformed a standard hearing into a legal warning Rick Scott never anticipated. Before we examine how Jasmine Crockett revealed the critical weaknesses in Rick Scott's ICE immunity legislation, while simultaneously constructing a case that could circumvent federal protection entirely, make certain you hit that subscribe button because this narrative involves unlawful detentions, evidence retention, and the moment when safeguarding law enforcement became protecting criminals. The combined House-Senate hearing on immigration enforcement had already been contentious for hours before Jasmine Crockett addressed the floor. Witness after witness had provided testimony about ICE operations that went beyond forceful enforcement into something more sinister. Citizens held without justification. Families separated based on appearance instead of legal standing. A climate of terror that was impacting entire communities regardless of citizenship status. Republican members kept maintaining these were isolated occurrences, operational errors that didn't indicate systematic issues. Democratic members kept presenting evidence indicating otherwise. Then Crockett spoke and the entire framework of the discussion shifted. She didn't begin with statistics or policy debates. She began with a direct declaration that made everyone in the chamber pay attention. I want to discuss Senator Rick Scott's proposed legislation to provide ICE agents immunity from what he terms lawfare frivolous lawsuits intended to harass law enforcement, because I've examined his bill. I've analyzed the language, and I want everyone to comprehend what it actually accomplishes versus what Senator Scott contends it does. She held up a copy of the legislation marked throughout with highlights and markers. On the surface, this bill appears reasonable, safeguarding law enforcement from baseless legal attacks. Who could oppose that? But when you examine the actual text, and I mean actually examine it, not just the summary that gets presented to the public, you uncover something troubling. This bill would provide ICE agents blanket immunity from civil liability for actions performed in the course of immigration enforcement operations. That sounds specific until you comprehend how broad immigration enforcement operations can be construed. Crockett flipped to a marked section. There's no stipulation that the action be lawful to qualify for immunity. There's no stipulation that the agent have reasonable suspicion or probable cause. There's no exception for constitutional violations. Under Senator Scott's bill, an ICE agent could hold a U.S. citizen without any legal foundation, violate their Fourth Amendment rights, cause emotional and financial damage, and face zero civil consequences because they were engaged in immigration enforcement operations. This isn't safeguarding law enforcement. This is establishing a class of government agents who operate above the law. The Republican members immediately protested, contending that Crockett was misrepresenting the bill's purpose. But she wasn't finished establishing why the bill was both hazardous and ultimately ineffective. And here's what Senator Scott and his co-sponsors appear not to comprehend. Civil immunity doesn't stop criminal prosecution. It doesn't stop state-level charges. It doesn't stop local prosecutors from pursuing cases when federal agents violate state laws. All this bill accomplishes is close off one avenue of accountability while presuming nobody will notice the others remain available. She let that sink in before making her point clear. So, when ICE agents hold U.S. citizens unlawfully, and we have documented instances of exactly that occurring, and when those agents believe they're protected by Senator Scott's immunity shield, they're going to be surprised when state attorneys general and local district attorneys begin pursuing criminal charges for false imprisonment. Kidnapping, civil rights violations under state law, federal immunity doesn't mean you're immune from state prosecution. And given what we're witnessing in these operations, state prosecutors are going to be very interested in some of these situations. The room had grown very silent. What Crockett was describing wasn't a theoretical legal concept. It was a roadmap for accountability that Scott's bill had evidently failed to consider. Republican members were consulting with their legal staff, clearly attempting to assess whether her interpretation was correct. Democratic members appeared energized, recognizing that she just outlined how to navigate around the federal immunity shield. But Crockett wasn't focused on the parliamentary maneuvering. She was focused on speaking directly to the individuals who'd been harmed by the violations she was describing. I want to address anyone who's been unlawfully detained, anyone who's witnessed these operations, anyone who has evidence of ICE agents breaking the law. This is critically important. Preserve everything, save every document, keep every photo and video, maintain records of everything that occurred, dates, times, agent names if you have them, badge numbers, vehicle identification, everything. Because Senator Scott's immunity bill can't protect agents from evidence. And when prosecutors, whether federal, state, or local, eventually pursue cases, that evidence is going to matter. The transition from legal analysis to direct address was powerful. She wasn't just making arguments to other members of Congress, she was issuing instructions to victims and witnesses, effectively mobilizing them to construct cases that would survive whatever protections Republicans attempted to implement. One of the witnesses who'd testified earlier, a U.S. citizen who'd been held for 3 days despite presenting documentation of citizenship, was visibly emotional, nodding along with Crockett's words. Then Crockett did something unexpected. She pivoted from the technical legal discussion to the broader historical and moral framework, and her language became more forceful. What we're witnessing isn't just aggressive immigration enforcement. It's a regime of terror that mirrors some of the darkest periods in American history. The slave patrols that terrorized black communities for generations operated on the same principle. Certain people don't have rights that need to be honored, so agents of the state can stop them, question them, detain them based purely on how they appear. The comparison to slave patrols was provocative and deliberate. Republican members immediately began protesting, calling it inflammatory and historically inaccurate. But Crockett held her ground. I'm not saying ICE is exactly the same as slave patrols. I'm saying the functional dynamics are comparable. When you empower government agents to stop people based on appearance, when you permit detention without adequate cause, when you establish legal immunity for those agents regardless of whether they followed the law, you've recreated the essential elements of a patrol system designed to control populations deemed suspect. History isn't repeating exactly, but it's rhyming, and we should be concerned by that rhyme. She addressed the room with visible emotion, now her voice carrying weight beyond the legal arguments. I want to apologize on behalf of the United States government to every person who's been unlawfully detained, every family that's been separated without legal justification, every community that's living in terror because of these operations. You deserve better. The Constitution promises you better. And the fact that our government has failed you is disgraceful. The apology caught everyone off guard. Members of Congress don't typically apologize on behalf of the government during hearings. It's considered presumptuous, overstepping the authority of one representative. But Crockett clearly didn't care about the convention. She was speaking to victims directly, acknowledging harm directly, refusing to hide behind procedural language or political positioning. Several people in the gallery, witnesses and family members who'd been affected by ICE operations, were openly crying. Republican members attempted to regain control by arguing that Crockett was turning the hearing into political theater rather than serious oversight. She responded by refocusing on the practical implications of Scott's bill and why it would ultimately fail to protect the agents it was designed to shield. Senator Scott believes he can pass a law that makes accountability disappear, but here's what he's missing. When you grant immunity without requiring legality, you incentivize abuse. You tell agents they can do whatever they want without consequences. And when that abuse becomes severe enough, when citizens are being detained, when constitutional rights are being violated, you create a political environment where even protection from allies can't survive public scrutiny. She outlined the exact scenario that Scott's bill couldn't prevent. Let's say an ICE agent detains a U.S. citizen, holds them for days despite documentation proving citizenship, and causes significant harm in the process. Scott's bill says the victim can't sue the agent civilly. Fine. But the state where this occurred can charge the agent with false imprisonment under state law. The local district attorney can bring charges. And when those criminal cases go to trial, all the evidence that's been preserved, the documentation, the testimony, the records comes out. Scott's immunity doesn't prevent that. It just means the accountability comes through a different door. The prediction was specific and damning. And here's what's going to make this worse for Senator Scott and anyone else who supports this bill. When those criminal trials happen, when evidence of abuse becomes public through state court proceedings, the political cost of having supported immunity for those agents becomes enormous. You will have voted to protect people who are being convicted of violating Americans' rights. That's not a position any politician wants to defend during re-election. She was essentially warning that Scott's bill would create a political time bomb for its supporters. Grant immunity, incentivize abuse, watch that abuse get prosecuted at the state level, face backlash for having protected the abusers. It was a logical chain that Scott's bill seemed not to have anticipated, and Crockett was making sure everyone understood the sequence. In a follow-up interview later that day on CNN, Crockett expanded on the arguments she'd made in the hearing, providing additional context that made her warnings even more pointed. The host asked about her controversial slave patrol comparison, giving her an opportunity to clarify or walk back. She did neither. When I said we're witnessing a regime of terror that mirrors slave patrols, I meant exactly that. We have documented instances of U.S. citizens with Latino heritage being detained because agents presumed their ethnicity meant questionable status. That's racial profiling. That's targeting people based on appearance. And when you provide immunity to agents engaging in that behavior, you re-sanctioning a patrol system designed to control certain populations. That's not left versus right. That's right versus wrong. The interviewer pressed her on Rick Scott's bill specifically, asking whether she thought the senator intended to enable abuse or simply wanted to protect agents doing difficult jobs. Crockett's response was pointed. I don't particularly care about Senator Scott's intentions. I care about what his bill actually accomplishes. And what it accomplishes is create legal protection for unconstitutional conduct. Maybe he didn't intend that. Maybe he didn't examine his own bill carefully enough. But the text is clear and the consequences are foreseeable. You shield agents from accountability, you get more abuse. It's not complicated. She issued a warning that would become the most widely shared clip from the interview. Senator Scott and anyone else supporting this immunity bill need to understand something. You can't legislate away evidence. You can't pass a law that makes witnesses forget what they observed, or victims forget what happened to them. You can attempt to block civil lawsuits, but you can't prevent criminal prosecution. You can attempt to shield federal agents, but you can't control what state prosecutors decide to charge. This bill is a temporary band-aid on a problem that requires actual reform. And when it fails, and it will fail, everyone who supported it is going to have to explain why they thought immunity was more important than accountability. Back in Washington, Rick Scott's office was dealing with the fallout from Crockett's very public dissection of his legislation. According to sources familiar with internal discussions, Scott's staff had presumed the immunity bill would be relatively uncontroversial among Republicans. Framed as supporting law enforcement against activist lawsuits, they hadn't anticipated someone with Crockett's legal background systematically explaining why the bill wouldn't function and could actually make things worse for the agents it purported to protect. The legislative strategy shifted almost immediately. A clarifying amendment was drafted that attempted to address some of the concerns Crockett had raised, adding language about reasonable belief of legal authority and exceptions for constitutional violations. But the damage was done. Democratic members who might have stayed silent about the bill now had a comprehensive roadmap for attacking it. Civil liberties organizations that had been focused on other matters suddenly made defeating Scott's immunity bill a priority. And state attorneys general, particularly in states with progressive prosecutors, started publicly stating that they would indeed bring state charges against federal agents who violated state laws, regardless of federal immunity. Perhaps most significantly, Crockett's call for evidence preservation was being heeded. Immigrant rights organizations began distributing materials, explaining how to document ICE encounters, what information to preserve, and how to ensure evidence would be available for future legal proceedings. It was grassroots legal preparation creating a distributed network of documentation that no immunity bill could eliminate. A legal analyst specializing in immigration law told reporters that Crockett had identified the fundamental weakness in Scott's approach. Federal immunity from civil liability doesn't prevent state criminal prosecution. It's a basic principle of federalism. States have their own laws, their own prosecutors, their own courts. A federal law stating federal agents can't be sued doesn't prevent a state district attorney from pursuing criminal charges under state law. Scott's bill is like building a wall on one side of a building while leaving the other three sides open. The analyst continued, what Crockett accomplished was threaten to route accountability through state systems, which are often more responsive to local communities and local concerns. If ICE agents believed they were protected by federal immunity and then find themselves facing state criminal charges, the political and legal calculus changes dramatically. For Jasmine Crockett, the hearing and interview became another example of her approach. Identify the real-world impact of legislation, explain it clearly enough that voters understand what's at stake, and outline specific strategies for resistance and accountability. She wasn't just opposing Scott's bill. She was explaining why it would fail and what people should do to ensure that failure. In a closing statement during the hearing that wouldn't make most news coverage, but that resonated deeply with the people in the room who'd been directly affected, Crockett spoke directly to victims and witnesses one more time. You are the light they're afraid of. Your stories, your evidence, your willingness to step forward despite fear. That's what accountability requires. Senator Scott's bill is designed to make you feel like speaking up doesn't matter. Like even when abuse occurs, there won't be consequences. But I'm telling you, preserve your evidence, tell your stories, and watch what happens when prosecutors who care about justice get their hands on what you've documented. Federal immunity doesn't mean impunity, and the agents who cross the line are about to learn that. The message was empowerment disguised as legal analysis. She was telling victims they had power that legislation couldn't remove, that documentation couldn't be legislated out of existence, that accountability would find its way through whatever doors remained open, even if some were closed. It was both a promise and a strategy, and it resonated because it came from someone who understood both the legal mechanisms and the human cost of the violations being discussed. Rick Scott's immunity bill would continue through the legislative process, picking up Republican support as a show of solidarity with immigration enforcement and Trump's broader agenda. But it would carry with it the stigma Crockett had attached. This was a bill designed to shield abuse promoted by politicians who cared more about protecting agents than protecting citizens' rights. And when, not if, but when cases emerged of agents hiding behind that immunity after violating Americans' constitutional rights, every supporter would have to answer for it. For Scott specifically, representing Florida with its significant Latino population, including many U.S. citizens, the political calculation was becoming more complicated. Crockett had made certain that everyone understood his immunity bill would protect agents who detain citizens based on ethnic appearance. That wasn't a sustainable position for a senator from a diverse state, and the political pressure was beginning to show. The question wasn't whether Scott's bill would pass. With Republican control, it probably would in some form. The question was what would happen afterward when the consequences Crockett had predicted started materializing, when state prosecutors started bringing cases, when evidence that had been carefully preserved started appearing in court proceedings. She'd issued a warning disguised as analysis, and everyone paying close attention understood that the warning wasn't just predictive. It was instructional, a blueprint for how to navigate around federal protection and ensure accountability happened. Anyway, if this breakdown of how Jasmine Crockett revealed the critical weaknesses in Rick Scott's ICE immunity bill while mobilizing evidence preservation showed you why legal expertise matters in political battles, hit that like button and subscribe for more analysis of the moments when legislators identify not just problems, but solutions. Drop a comment telling us whether you think state prosecutors should intervene when federal immunity shields constitutional violations, and share this with anyone who needs to understand that accountability isn't eliminated by legislation. It just finds different paths. Your engagement helps us keep covering the constitutional battles that determine whose rights get protected and whose violations get punished.